La Santé prison in Paris, built between 1861 and 1867 by the architect Émile Vaudremère. The 14th arrondissement of Paris, La Santé prison, 1,000 inmates, the last major jail inside the city. When it was built, it was one of the most modern prisons in the world. Designed to be rational, human, and moral, it worked on a confinement model whereby the inmates were locked up in individual cells. At the time, this was still a novel approach that had first been tested in 1704 at the Vatican's San Michele Youth Prison in Rome. 30 cells on 3 floors, with a common room in the centre that acted as a canteen, a workshop, and a chapel. But San Michele was an exception, for prison sentences as such didn't really exist until the late 18th century. Prison was only for debtors or defendants awaiting sentencing who might otherwise have fled. Everyone else was tortured, mutilated, or sent to a penal colony. In France, it was the Revolution of 1789 that abolished these inhuman punishments and replaced them with imprisonment, the classic penalty of the modern age. This made it possible to both discipline and punish people, to use the term coined by the philosopher Michel Foucault. A novel idea required a new form of architecture. This was modelled on the panopticon, invented by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, a circular structure that allows a single watchman positioned at the centre to observe everything happening around the perimeter. Equally well suited to the factory and the asylum, Bentham thought that the panopticon could purge society of all its evils. However, its ideal area of application was in prisons. Though this utopian vision was never realised, it had a major influence on new penitentiary architecture, particularly in the United States, which led the way in the early 19th century. To such an extent, indeed, that France sent 2 delegations there in 1830 to study this new American model in detail and come back with blueprints. Circular panoptica, semicircular semi-panoptica, which were less costly to build, and even simpler, radial prisons in which several spokes converge on a single hub. This craze for geometry inspired the architect Gilbert's plans for Mazas prison in Paris, built in 1850. The building no longer stands. It only traces a few pictures, including these drawings by a prisoner. Hailed as a great success, Mazas was Émile Vaudremère's model 10 years later when he designed La Santé prison. The first impression Parisian passers-by get of La Santé prison is this huge windowless wall that hides it from sight, as well as demonstrating the power of the law. Yet beyond its symbolism, this is a purely functional structure, whose height is fixed by the prison service to prevent both escapes and break-ins, and is standard for every prison in France. The material itself embodies these 2 values. Burstone, which is abundant in the Paris region, is rough, like justice itself, yet at the same time cheap, resilient and innovative on this scale at the time. Hidden behind this wall, which describes a regular trapezoid, is a radial panoptical prison situated in the lower section. Arranged around a central rotunda are 4 inmate facilities, a 5th building housing the various administrative departments, and 4 courtyards in the spaces between them. In the upper section, the architect opted for a more pragmatic, simpler layout based on other American models. La Santé prison was to replace Les Madelonnettes prison, which was due for demolition in 1858 to leave space for Rue de Turbigo, a new artery planned by Haussmann. Housed in a converted convent, Les Madelonettes was a jail for inmates serving short sentences and for defendants. Its location in the heart of Paris was practical for transporting defendants to and from the nearby High Court. La Santé prison was to be built on the edge of the city, but the construction of Boulevard Saint-Michel, another of Haussmann's major arteries, would make travel between the prison and the High Court just as easy. The chosen site was in one of the new districts recently established by the annexation of the former suburbs. A neighbouring barracks would provide security. This task was all the easier as this part of the 14th arrondissement was largely unoccupied at the time. An additional advantage was that the compulsory purchase of this empty land cost less. The surrounding roads were redrawn. The top of the trapezoid was bordered by a new street, Rue Messier, and on the north side by a new artery of Haussmann's devising, Boulevard Arago. The entrance is at the base of the trapezoid on Rue de la Santé. Here, burstone gives way to freestone and decorum. Yet its monumentality is reduced by the fact that the narrow street affords no distance from which to appreciate it. Placing the entrance on a side street was an unfortunate choice dictated by the rules of classical composition, which insists that the entrance be located on the line of symmetry. Some contemporary critics thought the iron gates designed by Vaudremere too graceful for a prison entrance, and they got their way. The entrance is now guarded by two sets of automatic gates, painted standard prison service blue. They give access to the main courtyard and the administrative building. The scene is more reminiscent of a manor house than a prison. The building houses the offices and official residences and all the departments such as the clerk's office, security search, etc., through which new arrivals have passed for a century and a half. The administrative building and its two outhouses are merely the antechamber to the prison, not the prison itself. The jail begins just behind, very close but separated from the administrative buildings by a second wall. The two inner walls protecting the administrative buildings are supplemented by two more around the yards. Between the outer and inner walls, a walkway runs around the entire site, bounded on the inside by walls or by the prison buildings themselves. This space, where everything is in full view, cuts off the prison from the street. Continuous patrols can keep watch over the cell windows, which are numbered for exactly this purpose, and prevent any communication and dealings between inmates. This is a no man's land, a void that is spanned in only one place, between the administrative building and the inmate facilities, by a windowed passageway whose transparency stands out amid the opacity of the surrounding walls. Once through the final sets of gates, one enters the rotunda, which is the nerve centre of the first part of the prison, known as the lower section. The glass office is a panoptical setup in which the control tower oversees access to the 4 prison wings radiating out from it. Nowadays it is equipped with cameras, but the prison they film is empty. Over the last few years, the inmates have all been gradually transferred to other institutions to allow for a major modernization program to begin in the coming days. We film the final hours of the prison in its original form. The prison service's strict brief called for the lower section to be modelled on what was known at the time as the Pennsylvania system, inspired by Philadelphia jail. Limited to inmates awaiting sentencing, it was the harshest form of imprisonment, solitary confinement, meaning that inmates were kept locked up night and day in complete isolation. The architect, reads a contemporary document, becomes the primary executor of punishment, the primary manufacturer of the instruments of torture. Each wing contains 125 cells spread over 3 floors of a large nave lit by windows at each end and skylights in the ceiling. Like everything else here, the size and fittings of each cell are determined by the authorities. 2 meters wide, 3.6 meters long, and 3 meters high with a barrel-vaulted ceiling. The cells had central heating and running water at a time when many buildings in Paris did not, and were therefore regarded as extremely modern. Some of the cells still have their original furnishings to this day, as well as bearing the marks of movements repeated 1,000 times. The metal bed fixed to the wall opened only for sleeping to save some space. The small folding table, the wash basin, the toilet. The bare necessities for a man locked in here 23 hours out of 24. The door is packed with prison technology. The lock. The spy hole. Covered on the guard's side. Decorated on the inmates. And a spring mechanism by which the inmate can call the guard, replacing the original compressed air system. The anti-suicide net is a recent addition, but the iron railings and oak floor of the walkways are more than 150 years old. The prison service thinks of everything. Even the width of the walkways is calculated with the imperatives of confinement and surveillance in mind. It is identical to the width of the cell door, so that when the door is opened at a right angle, a prisoner cannot squeeze between it and the railing to attack a guard. However, this means that the walkways were too narrow for the meal trolley. The solution was to add a trolley that rolled along the railings like train tracks. The prison designed by Vaudremere was also a great modern machine, with 2 30-meter chimneys and many miles of underground corridors containing all the apparatus needed to run the prison. A boiler room that was soon compared to an ocean liner's. Pipes that provided heating and ventilation in a closed loop. Kitchens that prepared 2 meals a day for 1,000 inmates. A factory for manufacturing imprisonment. The pillars on one of the yards in the lower section still bear traces of messages left by generations of inmates. Other marks are visible on the ground, lines radiating out from the centre. These are all that remains of the original design for the exercise yards. As an extension of solitary confinement in the cells, The yards were divided into individual segments for each prisoner to walk around under the eye of a lone guard stationed in the middle. The disadvantage of this system, observed one guard, was that the inmate no longer walked. He refused to step into the tight apex of the triangle and stood motionless at its widest part, up against the bars. To exploit the full surface area of his plot, Vaudremont opted to build trapezoid exercise yards. In the only surviving segmented yard, even the sliver of sky has disappeared, obscured by meshing and barbed wire that was installed after a spectacular escape by helicopter in the 80s. Yet even in the United States, this total confinement system drew heavy criticism from the very start. It was accused of being costly and cruel. It made prisoners mad and drove them to suicide. It was opposed by the more flexible system used in Auburn prison, which became known as the Auburn system. Each system had its advocates in France. A compromise solution allowed the two sides to reach an agreement. Total confinement would only be applied to the inmates awaiting sentences held in the lower section. The upper section would be built according to the Auburn model, of which one of the most famous examples at the time was Sing Sing Prison in New York State. This more flexible system was exclusively for convicts and combined individual cells with communal activities. The prison buildings are arranged around the outside. The space inside is divided into 4 exercise yards. The geometric model gives way to a different, vaguely medieval picture. Large keep-like towers stand at all 4 corners. This does not signal the end of the panopticon principle, though it is scaled down here. Glass-fronted offices on each floor allows guards to keep an eye on 2 prison wings at once. This part of the prison will be completely demolished and has been closed for 8 years. Another observation post overlooking the yards. This one is for observing the prisoners as they exercise. This yard with its flower beds is a long way from the cage segments of the lower section. Here the prisoners spent the day together, walking in the yards, and for working, mealtimes, lessons and prayers in common rooms with large arched windows on the ground floor, whereas the cells are on the floors above. Yet as space was calculated down to the last inch, the cells where prisoners spent the night are less innovative and smaller than those in the lower section. The upper and lower sections were designed as 2 sealed and separate units. The aim was to prevent any communication between those convicted and those standing trial. The only permissible contact was via religion. The central rotunda is not only the hub and control tower of the lower section. Combining the useful with the symbolic once again, the architect set an altar on top of the glass office where a priest celebrated Mass. Inmates in the lower area could follow this, theoretically at least, through their half-open doors. And those in the upper section were assembled in a chapel on the ground floor of the building, linking the 2 sections. The gangway by which the altar was reached is still here, but the altar itself has disappeared, a collateral victim of the separation of church and state, and been replaced by a storage cupboard. As for the chapel, it was first converted into a visiting room, then far more recently into a corridor connecting the upper and lower sections. Originally, however, there was no such link, and the desire to completely separate the two areas gave the architect a serious headache. He had built two prisons in one, but he had only one entrance. He circumvented this difficulty by creating two separate routes from the administrative building. A ground-level route leads straight to the rotunda in the lower section. The other goes down into the basement and re-emerges in the upper section. The only remaining sign of this underground route is its starting point. The stairs at the other end have been closed off and the corridor converted into a storage space. This is just one of the many alterations the prison has undergone since it was built. Various traces of them have survived. For example, these pretty multicoloured bricks, whose incongruous adornment is a surprising feature of the facades in the upper section. Some were used to block up the large arched windows of the communal workshops and canteens, which were removed in 1880 following a decision to extend the total confinement system to the entire prison. The unblocked windows were incorporated into new cells. There are other signs of the conversion of the entire upper section to total confinement. The numbers below the windows. Two adjacent windows bear the same number. The cells in the upper section were intended for night use only and too small, so two had to be knocked into one, the size of a living room, said one contemporary journalist, who was clearly more accustomed to living rooms than to cells. The new cells were fitted with two spy holes, one in the surviving door, one where the old door used to be. From the very start, though, the prison suffered from a chronic shortage of space. As early as 1873, it was clear that it was too small, or else there were too many prisoners, 1,300 inmates for 1,000 cells. Enough to cast doubt on the principle of total confinement, which nonetheless retained the prison service's support. A sign. When the prison was built, the outer wall hid the upper section, making it invisible from the street. But an extra story was added in 1890, and since the outer wall was not raised accordingly, the additional story sticks up, creating a visual and physical link to the outside world, something additional meshing sought to prevent. A more trivial yet equally symbolic detail, the tall chimneys of the lower section, which used to be visible from the main road, were truncated in the 1980s. For a century and a half, the prison has tried to adapt to a changing society, attempting to make its old walls tally with new ideas, new laws, new practices, a new vision of imprisonment and rehabilitation. But the most spectacular and most visible change has taken place in the city itself. The former outskirts have grown denser, and the prison is now hemmed in on all sides by blocks of flats. Whereas every other Parisian prison has long been banished to the suburbs, La Santé has remained an urban prison, practical for managing inmates and regarded as a privilege by convicts and their families. La Santé, this remarkably ugly monument, wrote Maxime Ducamp in 1880. A Parisian monument, preserved in part by the work undertaken to bring the prison up to modern standards. The external appearance of the lower section will remain unchanged, like a final tribute to the myth of the panopticon, while the upper section will be entirely rebuilt. Whatever the transformations, however, the prison will continue to show the dark side of architecture, an art of construction dedicated to duress, a primitive and brutal functionalism that nothing can temper or conceal. Except occasionally a prisoner's forgotten dream or a piece of poetry on a cell wall. The daylight fades and a lamp glimmers in the prison. We are alone in my cell. Beautiful clarity, beloved reason.